You don't need to give your opinion. I wish I could just end the episode there, but what fun would that be? I'll give you a bonus right off the bat. You don't need to give your opinion even if somebody asks for it. Now, why am I bringing this up? You know, I see on Facebook and Twitter and Reddit and other social media sources, maybe in real life, do people talk in real life? Lots of discussions going on, and they're not really discussions, right? They're arguments.
Ding dong, you're wrong.
Wrong, 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 wrong.
You're wrong.
He's wrong. You're wrong.
People are throwing their opinions out. It's combative. You know, I think that even in the context of writing, we lose a lot compared to being in person. We lose the body language, the facial expressions, the tone of voice, and it makes it easier to be angrier or to at least come off that way. In fact, I think that we probably say things in social media that we wouldn't say to somebody face to face. And moreover, I feel like it's really not bearing fruit, or at least not the kind of fruit that we would hope it is bearing. The fruit it's bearing is mostly anger, resentment, and entrenchment. Nobody really seems to be interested in learning or growing or changing their mind. Let me start off the bat with a couple of verses. Have nothing to do with foolish, ignorant controversies. You know that they breed quarrels. But avoid foolish controversies, genealogies, dissensions, and quarrels about the law, for they are unprofitable and worthless. If you're familiar with these verses, you know that they are really focused primarily on teaching Christian truth, Christian doctrine. Some of them are explicitly so, some of them just implicitly so. And you may think, well, that doesn't really apply to other contexts, other kinds of discussions, other topics, but really it does. Think of it this way. If the author is saying, for the most important things, meaning Christian truth, don't get involved in quarrels and dissensions and pointless arguments. If he's saying that even in the most important things, Christian truth, we ought not to be getting into arguments, surely the authors would also say, for other things that matter less, it also makes sense to not get into arguments. Giving your opinion is a trap that absolutely everybody falls into. Why? Because there's a huge number of topics out there that we feel strongly about. Politics, vaccines, racism, LGBT issues, climate change, immigration, the national debt, socialism, deposing foreign governments, military spending, Social Security, taxes, healthcare, creationism, privacy, homeschooling, schools of choice, legalization of recreational drugs, profiling for terrorism, the pandemic response, wealth disequilibrium, wealth redistribution, guns, spiritual gifts, evolution, divorce, social justice, religious freedom, the death penalty. Somewhere in this list is something you feel strongly about. I guarantee it. And if I really didn't find something in that list that you feel strongly about, there's something that I didn't think of. We're all caught up in this situation where if somebody mentions something on a topic that we feel strongly about, number one, we immediately pay attention, and number two, we're looking to see, do they agree with our position or do they disagree? And if they disagree, we feel compelled to give our opinion. Let me break down this in a little bit more detail. Why do we feel compelled to give our opinion? Well, the first, most importantly, we're convinced we're right, or at least more right than the other person. What I mean to say is we don't really think of our opinions as opinions. We think of our opinions as truth. Secondly, we're infuriated when we see somebody else have an opinion that we are convinced is wrong, and it provokes us to respond. Thirdly, when we see people perpetuating what we see as falsehood, we feel compelled to respond, and especially if that falsehood seems to have broader implications. We're not talking about issues here that we argue about that are really inconsequential, like, for instance, what way you put the toilet paper roll. it goes this way, by the way. That's the right way. No, we're talking about bigger issues. Like, for instance, if you see somebody have a wrong opinion on vaccines, well, you feel like you're not just arguing about the science. You're concerned about broader issues of public health. If you're arguing about a particular activity that may or may not be sin, you're not really arguing just about that in your mind. You're arguing about the compromise that's infiltrating the church, and it feels like a huge issue. Fourth, sometimes we just want to be heard, we want to vent, or even that we want our views to be affirmed. Fifth, sometimes we think that serving God means that we have to disseminate truth. This is a whole area where I plan to have a separate episode, but part of the problem may be Christian pride, feeling that sort of I have a leg up on others because I know God, I know the Bible. And then lastly, number 6, sometimes we just think that if you hold a certain view, you're just less Christian or less patriotic, or you're just plain stupid. Like, how could you believe that? And we just have to give our opinion. Or, in the worst case, you are a tool of Satan. You are being deceived. That's also part of Christian pride. And again, we'll talk about that in a separate episode. Before we go on, let me just acknowledge that the Bible absolutely places a high value on understanding and knowledge and gaining wisdom. But its focus is really on telling you, the individual, to seek knowledge and wisdom and understanding. Very little of the Bible is talking about you telling other people what truth is, you correcting other people. For instance, the wise lay up knowledge, but the mouth of a fool brings ruin near. The wise lay up knowledge. That means that they're seeking it out. They're looking for it. They're trying to accumulate it. But it's not saying that they're accumulating it for the purposes of telling other people what they've learned. There are verses that do talk about teaching others, but they're in the minority. For example, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ. So first of all, this verse is talking about Christian truth, all right? It's not talking about vaccines and politics and that sort of thing. More importantly, it's talking about speaking the truth in love. If there was no need to add the in love part, it could just say speak truth. Speaking truth in love means having respect for the other person, not getting angry, being humble, which we'll get to more in a moment. You can't just yell and scream your opinion or state it as if you are the smart one and the other person's the dumb one. If they would just pay attention to you, then everything would be all right. The lips of the wise spread knowledge, not so the heart of fools. It's not clear to me if this verse is really talking about or charging us with spreading knowledge so much as it is describing the character of the wise versus the character of the fool. Even more importantly, though, it's in contrast to other verses which say quite the opposite, also in Proverbs. The prudent keep their knowledge to themselves, but a fool's heart blurts out folly. Whoever restrains his words has knowledge, and he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding. So these verses seem to suggest that the wise hold their tongue. You actually demonstrate to God and the angels how wise you are when you don't immediately respond with your opinion when you see somebody saying something that you think is just plain wrong. Still, it looks like maybe there's some conflict in the Bible about what you ought to do with regard to expressing your opinion or educating others. So let's look at some verses in the New Testament. Aspire to live quietly and to mind your own affairs. Another translation reads, mind your own business. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. These verses imply that, by and large, it's better to hold your tongue. Let's also take a look at the Beatitudes. So these are the sorts of things that Jesus thought would make people happy, spiritually prosperous, to be envied. You'll note that there's essentially nothing in here about promoting truth or correcting falsehood. Again, surely those are important, but they're not in this list. They don't appear to be Jesus's number one priorities when it comes to what makes for happy children of God. I see in this list the number one characteristic being humility, which we'll get to in a moment. By the way, being persecuted for righteousness, you're not being persecuted if somebody disagrees with you. What about the fruit of the Spirit? Here's my list. Some of the things that I notice in here that I think are directly relevant for giving your opinion is kindness, gentleness, self-control. I mean, even if you are going to give your opinion, expressing it in anger, not okay. Disrespect for the other person, not okay. I'll note here that the fruit of the Spirit doesn't include like wisdom, correct thinking, correct theology. Those are surely important things, but they're not in this list. I want to go back to the issue of humility. You know, in the Beatitudes, it said, blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor in spirit. Instead, we tend to think we are right, or at least we're better informed than the other people. But you might be wrong. We don't think we're wrong, of course, but you might be, and you need to acknowledge that. We're all working with incomplete information. Some of us are just parroting what we've heard elsewhere.
But David, what does Donald Rumsfeld have to say about this?
There are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know.
And this is a problem with us expressing our opinion. We actually don't know what we don't know. There may be information out there. In fact, there's likely to be information out there that doesn't quite fit in with our opinion. We just don't even know it exists. We don't even know it's a possibility. We think that what we know is all we need to know. Now, what if you're reacting to this and you're saying, you know, I hear you, Dave, but I just feel compelled to teach others. Let me remind you of a verse that directly responds to the issue of teaching others. Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. So this is really important. You may not think of yourself as a teacher, but if you're giving your opinions and you are actually swaying people, which I actually think is probably not that likely. People are actually not all that receptive to, especially in social media, to changing their mind. But if you are, you're having an influence. And if that influence is in the wrong direction, from God's point of view, you're going to be judged more strictly. Maybe you're also listening to this and you're thinking, you know, and I see something that's just plain wrong. I just can't not say anything. My response to that is, yes, you can. You can not say anything. You're not responsible for correcting all the falsehood that's out there. Now, you may also say, well, you know, what about that quote? All that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. Yes, I understand. And you may be thinking, you know, if I don't say anything, then falsehood continues and expands unfettered. I understand the compulsion. And I would just say, well, are you trading the self-satisfaction for having given your opinion for agitation and discord in relationships? Consider that maybe giving your opinion is actually not helping nearly as much as you might think. Here's a little test for how effective you may be at getting other people to change their minds and consider what you've had to say. What if somebody else does something like, here's an important article I think everybody should read, and you actually take a look at it? How often do you respond by changing your mind? How often do you say, you know, maybe I should think about this particular issue differently? Do you instead look in that article for the things that either affirm what you already believe or the things you think are wrong, and then you respond by telling the person who posted the article what's wrong with the article? If you are unlikely to change your mind when other people give their opinion to you, don't expect other people to change their minds. All right, as we close here, let me add that I'm not saying you should never give your opinion, but most of the time it's probably not worth it. How do you know when it might be worth it? Well, if the other person says, I'm open to changing my mind, I'm open to input, or they actually say, I want your opinion. Okay, maybe. Also keep in mind, however, that it's really hard to express opinions in a way, especially when the topics are big deal topics and you feel really strongly and the other person's on the opposite side of the issue. It's really hard to have a discussion that doesn't actually damage relationships, where you can continue to be friends. And finally, what's the worst that can happen if you don't bring up your opinion? Well, maybe the wrong thinking on the part of that other person continues, but you get to keep your peace. So remember, you don't have to have the last word. You can remind yourself that, not my circus, not my monkeys, or let it go, sing the song to yourself if you have to. Here's a couple of last verses that may be of help. If a wise man has an argument with a fool, the fool only rages and laughs, and there is no quiet. A fool gives full vent to his spirit, but a wise man quietly holds it back. Thanks for watching. I hope this helps you. Now go forth and be quiet.